Hi, everyone. This is the third and I hope final installment in this video series on the Christian church and Christian history. In the first video, we covered a number of topics, including the Jewish roots of Christianity, Jesus, the apostles, including Paul, Roman persecution of Christians as well as Jews, the Fourth Crusade, the split between Catholics and Orthodox that it led to. Actually, to be more precise, we should say the split between Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. I'll come back to that. The split between Catholics and Eastern Orthodox that this led to. And we finished by saying a little bit about Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation in the early 1500s. That was the first video. In the second video, we talked quite a bit about Christological debates, debates about the nature of Jesus and their roots in Scripture and tradition and philosophical theology, specifically about the Trinity and the incarnation or two natures of Christ. We talked about the ecumenical councils, including the Council of Nicaea, and that's largely what we did in the second video. In this video, I want to say more about the Catholics, the Protestants, that I like to divide into two main groups, and the Orthodox, which we can divide into several groups, the largest being the Eastern Orthodox, and that's the group that we've mostly focused on so far. Again, something that can make this all really confusing, and we really can't avoid it. This is just how the terms are used, and we've inherited them. What makes things a bit confusing, and I went into this some in the second video, if not the first video, is that in English, we sometimes write Orthodox with a big O, and we sometimes write it with a small o. And when we write Orthodox or Orthodoxy with a big O, we're talking about a certain group of Christians that does not include the Catholics or the Protestants. But when we write Orthodox with a small o, we're talking about a group of Christians that includes actually not all of the Orthodox big O, but it includes the Eastern Orthodox with a big O, and it includes the Catholics, and it includes most but not all Protestants. This is kind of confusing. The word orthodoxy and the related word orthodox, it comes from some Greek terms that mean right belief or right glory. I think there might be another meaning or two of those terms. Orthodox Christians with a big O often like to think of orthodoxy in terms of right glory, or I think sometimes right worship. I really should know this as an Orthodox Christian myself, but you go look that up. In the West, Catholics and Protestants and English speakers, we often think of it in terms of right belief. And really, you don't have to worry too much about that. But it is a bit confusing that we use this word Orthodox in some really, really different ways. We use it in some really, really different ways. Again, when we use Orthodox small o, Orthodox small o, and again, when we use it small o, I'm taking it to cover the Eastern Orthodox, the Catholics, and many but not all Protestants. I'm really using this term here to refer to the Christians that affirm the doctrine of the Trinity and the doctrine of the incarnation, or the two natures of Christ. Again, the Trinity, there's one God in three eternally distinct persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and the doctrine of the incarnation, that Jesus was both God and man, that Jesus of Nazareth had two natures. He was a God-man, God and man, that the second person of the Trinity, the Son incarnated, was conceived in Mary's womb and born, and there it is, right? So that's how I'm using the term. That's how we often use the term Orthodox small o, when it comes to Christianity. So who believes those doctrines, the Trinity and the two natures of Christ, the incarnation? Well, the Roman Catholics, many Protestants, but not quite all, and the Eastern Orthodox. There are, as I mentioned previously in the first video, there are some other Orthodox groups out there that don't fully affirm the Trinity and or the incarnation. Now, and there's a number of them, and historically they have had different complaints with the Trinity and the incarnation, the two natures of Christ. So, it's really, really complicated. And by the way, one of the largest groups, I mean, I think it's got to be the largest group of Christians that are called Orthodox, but not Eastern Orthodox, are a group of Christians from Egypt called the Coptic Christians, And they do believe in the Trinity. And when it comes to Jesus, it's complicated. They do actually believe, in a sense, yes, he is a man, and yes, he's God. And so it might sound, well, then it sounds like the incarnation and the two natures of Christ. And there are actually a number of scholars now that say, yeah, I mean, basically these Coptic Christians and a number of these other non-Eastern Orthodox, their beliefs really do basically come down to the Trinity and the two natures of Christ. There really isn't any major disagreement on substance. There may be some differences in the way that these doctrines are put, and those differences might be kind of minor, or maybe maybe there's no real differences at all. They really disappear. It just seems like they disappear on close analysis. It just seems like they disagree because the terms are being used in different ways. Some scholars have argued that in the case of some of these Orthodox churches that are not Eastern Orthodox churches, it was largely, political issues that led to the split. There's a lot of complicated details around this, and I don't really want to go into it much more. I will say that I haven't studied this issue in great detail, but my sense is that for some of these non-Eastern Orthodox, some of the Orthodox that we don't call Eastern Orthodox, that we call Oriental Orthodox, and there's some other groups out there as well, they really pretty much do affirm both the Trinity and the two natures of Christ. It may just be terminological, either just using terms in different ways, or some very relatively minor differences in expression, ultimately, that account for the divides here. And I'll just say a little more about it, and then I'm gonna set it aside. I'm gonna set aside all the Orthodox except for the Eastern, which are the largest. When you look at the Catholic Church, what you see is it's very, very large. Again, I don't remember how many members the Catholic Church has. Can it be 1 billion? I don't know if it's 1 billion, but it's hundreds and hundreds of millions. I mean, I would guess off the top of my head, this is dangerous. I should have looked this up before but I mean, I would guess it's probably at least 700-800 million, something like that. It's a very, very large organization. I would think the Catholic Church is actually the largest religious organization in the world, and maybe the largest human organization in the world. It's very large. And you can find Catholics that think differently about different things in the Catholic Church. Being Catholic doesn't mean you have to have, the exact same positions on absolutely everything. There are some things that you're supposed to believe, and then there's freedom on other things, right? But you can find Catholics that are conservative, Catholics that are liberal, conservative on some issues, liberal on others. I mean, you got it. There's and there can be differences on theological views and so forth and so on, at least on some theological views. So you can find, you can always find diversity of thought to some extent, among humans. But, sometimes there's some real tensions in the Catholic Church. But despite that, it's one church. The Catholic Church there aren't formal divisions within it. There are orders, there's like the Franciscans and the Dominicans and the Benedictines and things like that. But those aren't different sects or like formal divisions within the church. They're all Catholics, right? They're all Catholics. Okay, I mean, there's even some difference in worship style, which we talked about before, but they're all Catholics. We're talking here about the Roman Catholic Church. They're all Catholics, right? When it comes to orthodoxy, it's in Protestantism, it's a bit more complicated than that. When you look at orthodoxy, we can divide it up into the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox, and there are even some other groups besides those. When it comes to the Eastern Orthodox, what you have are really a bunch of I'm going to simplify this a little bit for our purposes, which I think is fine, but what you have are a bunch of national churches. So the largest of these are the Russian Orthodox, which are in the news a lot these days, Ukrainian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, which is maybe actually the most well-known in the United States. There is the Antiochian Orthodox, which is in Syria. I mentioned that before. There's the Bulgarian Orthodox, and so forth and so on. There's also an Orthodox church in America, right, which is Eastern Orthodox. And so what happens here is that you have these different countries that are Eastern Orthodox, right? And they're not united in the same way that the Catholics are, like under one pope. The Roman Catholics have this pope. The Eastern Orthodox don't have a pope. They just have the bishops without this pope, though they also have these patriarchs who are figures of authority in the church. But nonetheless, even though there isn't like an Eastern Orthodox pope that binds them all together, these churches are in communion with one another. They regard themselves as one tradition, the Eastern Orthodox, and they do regard themselves as one church, right? And they share, basically the same beliefs and practices. I mean, there's some differences here and there, but they tend to be fairly minor. And again, even in the Catholic Church, there's different worship styles. A lot of American Catholics aren't even aware of that. Well, actually, you might be aware of the Latin Mass. That's not the same as the current Mass. Well, there you go. There's some differences in worship style even within the Catholic Church. So there's more we could say about it, but I'll leave it there. So again, for the Eastern Orthodox, some of the main churches are the Russian, Ukrainian, Greek, Antiochian, the Orthodox Church in America, the OCA, and you have other ones too, like the Bulgarians and the Romanians, and there's others. When it comes to the Oriental Orthodox, I think there's 6 main Oriental Orthodox churches, and these include the Coptic Orthodox, again, who are in Egypt, come from Egypt. Egypt was one of the first Christian lands, right? And there's still, even though it's a majority Muslim country today, there's still something like, I think, 10%, 15%, there's different estimates of Egyptians today who are Christian, and almost all of them belong to the Coptic Church. There is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the Eritrean Orthodox Church. There's the Armenian Orthodox Church, and the Malankara Orthodox Church, which is in India. And I think there's one more I'm forgetting, but anyhow, so there's those, and then there's a number of other churches that go under the name Orthodox. Some of which are headquartered in Iraq, and some of and other places. So I'm also looking at the Middle East here. So there's that. And when we turn to Protestantism, of course, as some of you may be aware, there are thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Protestant denominations. Protestantism starts in the early 1500s with Martin Luther, and the Protestants very quickly split and split and split and split and split. There's lots and 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 lots of Protestants. Now, if you look at what distinguishes the Eastern Orthodox from the Oriental Orthodox and other Orthodox, there's often very complicated historical reasons behind it, and you can often find various differences in how they worship and other things, but but at the root of a lot of at the root of these splits, it was at least the old story is that it was rooted in Christological disputes, where the Eastern Orthodox believed a doctrine of the Trinity and believed the doctrine of the two natures of Christ, the doctrine of the incarnation, or at least that they believed certain versions of it, and that these other Christians did not. Now, as I said a little bit ago, it actually might be a little more complicated than that, but there it goes, right? When you look at the Protestants, there's many, 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 many different groups among the Protestants. I'll just mention a few of the big ones. There's the Lutherans, named after Martin Luther, right? The founder of the Protestant Reformation. You have the Reformed tradition, which is sometimes called the Calvinist tradition, which is actually not a great name for it because Calvin was not the first person in that tradition and certainly wasn't the last. And it's not the case that everybody in that tradition believed exactly what Calvin believed, but so it's actually more accurate to call it the Reformed tradition. There's the Baptist tradition that many of you have probably heard of. Some of you may be Baptist. There's the Anglican tradition. There's the Methodist tradition. There's many, many. We also have groups such as the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses. And within some of these groups, there's more division. Some of these Protestant churches, there's division within division within division, right? So actually, even though we often talk about the Mormons in this country, there's actually a number of different churches that identify as Mormon. When we look at the Lutheran tradition, there's different groups of Lutheran, there's different groups of Methodist, there's different groups of Baptist, so forth and so on. Then there's non-denominational Protestant, right? I mentioned in a previous video that there are a fair amount of Christians in Korea, almost all of whom are Protestant. They all fall under a tradition called the Presbyterian, which has got some interesting connections with the Reformed tradition. And I've heard that there's lots of different Presbyterian churches in South Korea, that it's just split in South Korea. I once heard a Protestant from Texas tell me that when he grew up, they had a joke in his Baptist church, which was, let's make like a Baptist church and split. You have lots of splitting within Protestantism. You have some splitting within the so-called Orthodox churches. Within Roman Catholicism, it's pretty much still one church, right? Which is actually, it's kind of interesting, the history and traditions behind all of this. Now, I talked again, just to summarize this guy, and I know there's a lot of names here and concepts, and some of this might be confusing. Just bear with me, and you could rewind the video. Some of the stuff is covered in a textbook. I could send you some other resources on it if you're really interested. Just to recap, the Catholics believe in the Trinity, and they believe in the incarnation, the two natures of Christ. The Eastern Orthodox believe in the Trinity and the incarnation, the two natures of Christ. Some of the Orthodox that are not called Eastern, that are called Oriental, maybe they do basically really believe both of those doctrines as well, though for various reasons it was at least thought that they didn't believe them in the exact same way, both of the doctrines for some time. And so actually maybe we should, maybe that should be more fully recognized. If we're applying the term, if we're applying Orthodox small o, again, in a way that it means those who believe in a Trinity and the incarnation of two natures of Christ, we're going to get the Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, maybe some of these Oriental Orthodox, right? What about the Protestants? Do the Protestants believe in the Trinity and the two natures of Christ? Well, as I said earlier, a lot of them do, but not quite all of them. So which are what are some examples of Protestants that do not believe in a Trinity and do not believe in the two natures of Christ. Well, I've actually read that there are some churches that identify as Mormon and that do affirm both of these doctrines, and I haven't investigated that, but if that's true, then there would be some self-identifying Mormon churches that we would call Orthodox small o, right? But the largest church of Mormon does not. It does not believe either of these doctrines. It does not believe either of these doctrines. It has a Christology that is, much more close akin to Arianism, as we discussed in the second video, and actually it's much more complicated than that. So the Mormons, who many of you have probably heard of, the largest group of Mormons, they don't believe the Trinity or the two natures of Christ. They believe something more along the lines of Arianism. And that is also true for the Jehovah's Witnesses. They don't believe in the Trinity. They don't believe in the two natures of Christ. They believe something about Jesus that's more along the lines of Arianism. And so what we could do then with Protestantism is we can see that, again, if we're tying the Orthodox small o to the Trinity and the two natures of Christ, most Protestants would count as being Orthodox small o, because most Protestants affirm these doctrines, right? Most of the Lutherans and the Reform and Presbyterians and Anglicans and Methodists and Baptists and so forth, most of them do affirm both of these doctrines. We would call them Orthodox small o, but there's some that do not. We could call them non-Orthodox or unorthodox or heterodox, or I guess, some people would call, well, some would say they're heretics, but then these folks might say the others are heretics, and that's just how it goes with that kind of thing. I like to use the terms Nicene and non-Nicene. What does Nicene mean here? Nicaea, affirming the Nicene Creed, which affirms the Trinity and the two natures of Christ, right? So it's just another way of saying that, if we're going to divide the Protestants into the Nicene and the non-Nicene, that's really just dividing them up into the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox, because again, I'm taking Nicene and Orthodox here to mean Trinity and two natures of Christ. That's what it is. And again, so most Protestants would count as Nicene, would count as Orthodox small o, but some would not. Okay. And what does this all do? Well, it helps us to actually understand why we're calling all of these, it helps us to explain what the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox and some of the non-Eastern Orthodox and most of the Protestants, what they all have in common, right, is that they believe in the Trinity and the two natures of Christ. There's a question here, though. What about the Christians that don't believe both of these doctrines? What about the Protestants that don't? And what about some of those other Orthodox that don't? Generally, we still call them Christian, even though, and they call themselves Christian. The Mormons call themselves Christian, right? The Jehovah's Witnesses do. These other Orthodox do. What do we do with those people? Right? How are they Christian? How are they Christian if they're not Orthodox? If they don't believe the Trinity and the two natures of Christ, what makes them Christian? And actually, a lot of Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and the Orthodox Protestants, they would say many of them would say, well, if you don't believe in the Trinity and you don't believe in the two natures of Christ, you're not Christian at all. So there are actually quite a few Christians out there that would say that you can't be Christian at all unless you believe in the Trinity and the two natures of Christ. Now, some Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and some of these Orthodox Protestants, they would say, well, they'd say, no, I think the Trinity is true, the two natures of Christ are true, but I'm not going to really make a big deal out of not calling these people Christian, right? But why? How do scholars think of this, right? Why would we call all these people? Why would we call them all Christian if they don't all believe in the Trinity and the two natures of Christ? There's got to be something that binds them. Something that binds them, right? Well, you can go back to the last video that I made on this. When you look at the Christians that don't believe both the Trinity and the two natures of Christ, right? They still share a lot of the views about Jesus that the Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, and most of the Protestants accept. So, and what are those beliefs? Well, they believe that Jesus really walked the earth in some form or other, but then again, so do atheist scholars. That doesn't get us very far. But it's not just that they believe that Jesus walked the earth in some fashion. They believe that he really performed these miracles. He really died on the cross. He really rose from the dead, and that by doing this, he somehow enables forgiveness of sins in a way that nothing else really enabled. That in this sense, he's the savior of the world, right? So they still believe some, pretty exalted claims about Jesus that would not be accepted traditionally by Jews, Muslims, and other people, right? So that's why. So that's one reason why we would just, still scholars would count them as part of the Christian fold. So they claim to be Christian. They do share some of these beliefs about Jesus, and they often have some pretty interesting and important historical connections with the other Christians. And again, you could find Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and Orthodox Protestants who would want to exclude them from the Christian fold for not believing in the Trinity and the two natures of Christ. But others would not be so insistent upon that. And there it is. Now we're already about 26 minutes in, and we have reminded ourselves what we mean by Orthodox small o, and we've said something about the different types of Orthodox and the different types of Protestant, and said something about what is it in virtue of which we might call all of these folks Christian, and within that larger Christian fold, what is it that really kind of unites the Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, some of the Oriental Orthodox, I presume, and a lot of the Protestants? What unites those and distinguishes them from other Christians, right? So, but I want to start going into some more detail on this. And one thing we could note right now is that even though some forms of Protestantism actually can seem pretty close to Catholicism in some ways, but a lot of types of Protestantism seem very, very different than Catholicism and sharply distinguish themselves from Catholicism. Nonetheless, a lot of Protestants, the majority of Protestants, do share some very, very important beliefs with the Catholics, including the Trinity and the two natures of Christ. And that's not all. They share the New Testament, and actually Protestants have a slightly different Old Testament than the Catholics, but they share a lot of their Old Testament. So their Bibles are pretty similar, and they share those core beliefs about Jesus. Most of the Protestants do with the Catholics. So there's some real differences, but also some things they really have in common. And one thing I want to do now is I want to focus on the Christians in the early church that are going to eventually become the Catholics and the Orthodox, right? We could talk. I want to focus on what those people believe and what those people do. And once again, what we want to do is we want to try to see what do they have in common, and how do they differ. So again, we have these groups of Christians, the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox. And again, they don't really come into existence until the early 1200s with that Fourth Crusade. That's when we get that split. And before that, again, if we set aside the so-called, heterodox and heretics, including some of those, very small non-Eastern Orthodox churches in the East, right? Basically we're talking about all the Christians, and it's most of the Christians, right, that are in existence around the time 1200, and maybe there's been some evolution here, some change in belief and practices, but these people have existed for a long time, right? We've got this very, very large, we could put it this way, we've got this very, very large group of Christians that's around basically from the beginning of Christianity, and it's split and become the Catholics and the Orthodox in the early 1200s, right? Again, it's a little bit of a loose way to put it, but we'll just leave it there. What do these people have in common, and what distinguishes them? Well, what do they have in common? These the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox? Well, as we've said many, many times now, the Trinity and the two natures of Christ. Well, okay, great. Is there anything else we can say about them? And in particular, are there things that they have in common that at least a lot of the Protestants are going to reject? Yes. Well, let's start looking at that. One thing that we could say about the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, in the early 1200s and today, and that this common group of Christians believe for hundreds of years, before the split, of the early 1200s. Here's some things that they believed, or some beliefs and practices. Number one, they were led by bishops. They're still led by bishops. They've had these bishops, right? Now again, the Catholics have a pope. The Eastern Orthodox don't have a pope, but both churches have bishops. We talked a little bit about bishops before. These are individuals of high teaching authority in a church. They ordain priests. They are in charge of large areas within the church. They were often found, and still are often found, in major cities. But it's not that every major city has a bishop, and only major cities have bishops. But a lot of important bishops historically were connected with large cities, right? They govern an area that we in English we commonly call a diocese, right? By the way, if you live right around COD, there's actually two within the Catholic Church. Now, I'm not talking about the Eastern Orthodox Church. Within the Catholic Church, in Northern Illinois, there's two main dioceses. There's at least around this area. I don't know if when you go further out west, but if you're around COD, the two main dioceses are the Diocese of Joliet and the Diocese of Chicago. And actually, if you attend a Catholic church in, let's say, Glen Ellen, you're in the Diocese of Joliet. And the Diocese of Joliet, it's a pretty large area. It's headed by the Bishop of Joliet, right? The bishop of the Diocese of Joliet. And if you live in Chicago, well, then you're in the Diocese of Chicago, that you are under the leadership of the Bishop of Chicago. So these bishops, they have charge over a large area. They oversee the churches, the priests, the congregants in that area. They have all sorts of ceremonial functions, like, as I said, like ordaining priests. They also have teaching authority. And some Protestants actually have bishops, but most do not. We're talking here about what is called ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church, or ecclesiastical structure. How is a church structured? Again, some Protestant groups actually have bishops, but most do not. Catholics and Orthodox have bishops. Not only that, the Catholics and the Orthodox claim that their bishops go all the way back to the apostles, that there is like this unbroken line of succession from the apostles to the bishops. How do we assess that historically? It's a bit difficult, but I think actually it's pretty plausible. It might be difficult to really, fully test that one way or the other for the first and maybe even the second generation of the bishops. But the Catholics and Orthodox can trace their bishops back at least, more than 1,800 years, if not 1,900 years or even more, all the way back to the apostles. They have this long tradition of bishops going back to the apostles, are awfully, awfully close. And that is something that is very important from the point of view of the Catholics and the Orthodox, because they both claim to be the heirs of the apostles, to have carried on this tradition of apostolic preaching and apostolic teaching, apostolic apostles, to basically be the direct descendants of the church founded by Christ, the church of the apostles, right? So that's a claim to the Catholics and the Orthodox. It's really, really important to them. Okay. Is there anything else we could say? Yeah, liturgy. liturgy or worship. The Catholics and the Orthodox, if you've ever attended a Catholic service or an Orthodox service, they tend to be highly structured, highly structured. There are different services in the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, and there could be little variations even in the same service from week to week, but they're pretty structured. If you go to an Orthodox Divine Liturgy on Sunday morning or the Catholic Mass on Sunday morning, again, there could be little differences from week to week, such as what songs they sing or what passages of the Bible they read, but it's very consistent. It's very consistent, highly structured, and and there's a couple different liturgies in the Orthodox Church that go back like at least 1,500 years. There's been a lot of different liturgies in the Catholic Church. And again, many of you may know that if you attend the average Catholic church around here, you'll hear a liturgy that's fairly new. You can still hear an older liturgy, the Latin Mass at some of the churches in the area, and there's even some other forms of worship. There's other forms of liturgy in the Catholic Church beyond the current Mass and the Latin Mass. And again, Eastern Catholics actually use the Eastern Orthodox forms of worship. So rich liturgy, rich structured liturgy. Catholic Mass usually goes about an hour. Eastern Orthodox services are usually like 1.5 to 2 hours. Here in the United States, I've heard sometimes they go longer in the old country, in Greece or Ukraine, places like that. The sacraments. Some of you may be familiar with the sacraments. The sacraments are often defined, at least in the Catholic tradition, as visible signs of invisible realities, defined as ritual ceremonies that mediate grace. What would grace mean in this context? It would mean God strengthening faith, strengthening trust, strengthening conviction, strengthening hope, strengthening love, strengthening charity in the believers through participating in these sacraments. That doesn't mean if you participate in a sacrament, you're automatically guaranteed to have some increase in these things. But the idea is that, and it's not that you have to participate in the sacraments to receive faith from God or hope from God or love from God. But the idea here is that these sacraments are ritual ceremonies, acts through which God offers grace in a specially assigned way, in a regular way. Some of these sacraments people can perform many, many times over the course of their life. Some you participate in once. Only some people can participate in them. The Catholics have, for a number of centuries now, officially restricted the sacraments to 7 in number. Let me see if I can remember all these. One is baptism, with which many of you are probably familiar. Baptism, Eucharist, or as Protestants often call it, the Lord's Supper, confirmation. These are regarded, by the way, as rites of initiation, entering into the church. You also have rites of penance or reconciliation, as it is sometimes called, and the sacrament of anointing of the sick, and the sacraments of holy orders and matrimony. So let's talk about some of these briefly. Anointing of the sick. I've actually never seen anybody receive the sacrament of anointing of the sick. I believe it is done with a specially prepared oil. But actually, I have seen it in the Orthodox Church. I just haven't seen it done in the Catholic Church. But it is a sacrament, at least in the Orthodox Church, and I'm guessing this is pretty similar to the Catholic Church. If somebody's really, really sick, traditionally it was often when people were close to death. Now a person doesn't necessarily have to be close to death. I know priests that will do it for people if it's mental illness they're really suffering with, but the priests will apply oil to them, pray over them, and you're petitioning God for healing here. And for people who believe in this, they think, sometimes it's effective, right? They might say God answers your prayer either way, but they're, in whatever way is best. But there it is, anointing of the sick. Holy orders is becoming a priest. There's special rituals, sacraments that go with that. Marriage is getting married, which is a sacrament in the Catholic Church. Reconciliation or penance is going to confession, confessing your sins, and being reconciled with God, turning back toward God, being reconciled with God, right? This doesn't mean that it's impossible to get any kind of forgiveness at all apart from going to confession, but there's complex theology around that. I'll just leave it there. For the purposes of this video, there's lots of other resources I can give you on that. We talked about baptism, Eucharist, confirmation. Confirmation in the Catholic Church is usually done when you're a little bit older. I think in a lot of churches around here, it's 8th grade or maybe in high school, and oil is applied to you and you are sealed in the Holy Spirit. And this is when you become like a full member of the Catholic Church. Let's set that aside. The two sacraments, so we've looked at 5 of the sacraments fairly briefly. 2 I want to look at in a little more detail are baptism and the Eucharist, which are viewed as rites of initiation in the Catholic Church. The Eucharist is a little bit funny. A lot of Catholics, they speak of First Communion, going for your First Communion, your first Eucharist, right? But, many Catholics, they take the Eucharist every week or nearly every week for the rest of their lives. So it's not that every time they're taking it, they're joining the church, right? You have people, Catholics are 80 years old who joined the church, decades and decades earlier. They're still taking the Eucharist. It's not that every week they're joining the church. They already joined it a long time ago. But, participating in the Eucharist for the first time, which often goes hand in hand with making your first confession in the Catholic Church, is viewed as entering the church on a deeper level, and it's a very important time for many Catholics. Let's talk a little more about this, about the Lord's Supper, or as the Catholics and Orthodox typically call it, the Eucharist. The Eucharist. So I imagine some of you, even if you're not Christian, you may be familiar with this. The idea here is that at a certain point in the service, blessings are made, prayers are made over bread and wine, and then the bread and the wine are distributed to the congregation. People come up and they take the bread and or the wine. In Catholic Church, the bread is usually a thin wafer, and you take the bread, and then the wine is actually not always offered. Actually, a lot of Catholic churches have not been offering the wine since the start of COVID and haven't really started doing it again. I think some actually, I actually think maybe they did start just doing it again very recently. But I remember, when I was growing up, I would see in the Catholic Church, there would be bread and almost always wine. A lot of times people would only take the bread and not take the wine. You would go up and you would receive the bread in your hand or receive it on your tongue, and from the priest or from somebody else who's serving it to you. The wine is drunk out of a common cup. I think that's maybe why some Catholics don't prefer to do it, because you're drinking from the same cup that everybody else is drinking from, right? And plenty of Catholics do it, but not quite all. And it's not always available in the church services, but it often is. And so that's what it looks like in the Catholic Church. It's a thin wafer, an unleavened wafer, and then there's a separate cup with the wine. In Orthodox churches, they actually take the bread, which is leavened bread, it's thicker bread, and they break it into pieces and put it in the wine cup, the chalice, and then it is served to the communicants on a spoon, right? So everybody's using the same spoon. In COVID, they varied it up, but that's basically how it goes. So there's some difference in exactly how it's administered. But something that is really kind of interesting about the Catholics And the Eastern Orthodox, it is often quite shocking to many Protestants and many non-Christians, is that the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, they believe that when they take that bread and that wine, they are actually consuming the body and blood of Jesus. In the Catholic Church in particular, it is emphasized that the bread and wine actually no longer exist. It looks like you can still see them, but they're really no longer there. It's only the body and blood of Jesus. Now, Catholics and Orthodox typically emphasize that you're not consuming the body and blood of Jesus in the exact same way that you would be like if you were, consuming a steak, right? It's a bit different than that, but it is real. It's not just a metaphor or a symbol. It is real. You can use a term like spiritual, but it is also regarded as real. The theology around this is really complicated, especially in the Catholic Church. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, we typically just say it's a mystery, and we don't try to explain it in all that much detail. In the Catholic Church, you've had theologians such as Thomas Aquinas explain it in some considerable detail. It's a very, very complicated subject. I'm not going to enter into the details of any of that. If you're interested, I could recommend all sorts of sources to you. But the thing to emphasize here is that the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox believe in what we can call the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. That when you eat the bread and drink the wine, you are really consuming the body and blood of Jesus. And this is viewed as a way of Jesus being intimately present to the believer, intimately communing with the believer, and also strengthening faith, strengthening hope, strengthening love, and affecting forgiveness for sins. I'll leave it there for now. So that the Eucharist, which means Thanksgiving in Greek. Again, Protestants often call it Lord's Supper. I'll come back to this when we get to Protestantism in a moment. Baptism for the Catholics and the Orthodox involves, well, if you're doing it with a baby, Catholics and Orthodox baptize babies, is putting the baby underwater. And there's various prayers that go with that, and rituals that go with that. I believe both Catholics and Orthodox use oil, and maybe oil in the water, or apply. I should know this. I've seen a number of baptisms in both, but it's been a couple of years. I think they use oil. I think it's in some way as part of the baptism proper, and this is viewed as like the first stage in coming into the church if you're a Catholic. And a really interesting difference here between Judaism, Islam, and Christianity is this. In Judaism, you can be born a Jew. In Judaism, for most Jews, if your mother is Jewish, when you are born a Jew. You are a Jew from birth. Traditionally, in Judaism, boys are circumcised, but that's not what makes the boy a Jew. It's a sign that the boy was born a Jew. In Judaism, you do not circumcise girls, but they're Jews from birth. And for most Jews, you really are a Jew because your mother was one. So the women better be Jews, right? You can't get any more Jews. So in Judaism, you're born a Jew. In Islam, you can be born a Muslim. Now, you can convert to Islam and Judaism. We talked a little bit in a previous video about conversion. In Judaism, it's a little bit complicated, right? But many Jews at least would say, yeah, you can convert. But you can be born as a Jew in Judaism, and you can be born as a Muslim in Islam. I think in Islam, it's typically the opposite as it is for many Jews. If the father is a Muslim, then the child is a Muslim, which is, I think, why, according to many scholars of Islamic law, a Muslim man can marry a Jewish or a Christian woman, but a Muslim woman is not supposed to marry a Jewish or Christian man. Okay. In Christianity, nobody is born a Christian. You become a Christian through baptism. Now, again, in Catholicism, there's actually there, at least the way I understand it, there's this understanding of deepening stages of entrance into the church, baptism. Then, when you're a bit older, I think around here in the United States, it's usually around second grade. You do your first communion. You take your first communion first. You make your first confession. So Eucharist, you're entering into the church, and then you do confirmation, maybe in eighth grade or high school, and that is like the third sacrament of initiation for Roman Catholics, right? For Orthodox, it's a bit different. For Orthodox, Orthodox don't actually restrict the sacraments to 7 in number. They've never really done that. Orthodox do baptize, and they baptize infants. That is for sure. But Orthodox give communion to babies, and they do something that's kind of like confirmation, which they call chrismation for babies. And so, you have a baby that goes through basically all these rites of initiation. And that's something that you see in Orthodox churches. It's sometimes kind of shocking to Catholics or a lot of Protestants. There are some Protestants who actually give the Lord's Supper to babies, but it's pretty rare. Orthodox churches, the babies go up and take the communion, right? And so you already see that there's some differences here in the way that the Catholics and Orthodox think about these sacraments. But and again, the Catholics restrict it to 7, the Orthodox don't, right? The Catholics, you do the baptism when you're a baby and your first communion later, and your confirmation later, where the Orthodox just kind of do the baptism, Eucharist and chrismation with the babies. There's some differences there, but there's a lot of similarities. And again, the idea is that the Catholics and the Orthodox have is that these sacraments, they're not just rituals, they're not just ceremonies, they're not just acts. The idea is that by participating in these things, with the rites of initiation, you are joining the church. You're becoming a member of the church, but also through participating in these. And again, the idea is not this works in a mechanical fashion, but the faithful can receive strengthening and faith, hope, love, and for some of these at least forgiveness of sins, right? So we talked about bishops, we talked about liturgy, we talked about sacraments. I could mention church calendar. Catholics and Orthodox have pretty structured church calendars. Oh, there's so much that could be said about that, but I'm just going to, skip over. I'm just going to have to skip over that in the interest of time. The saints, Catholics and Orthodox pray to saints. Now, the view here is not that the saints have like magical powers or they have powers to save you. The way that and again here, the theology is complex, but the way that the Catholics and Orthodox will often describe it is they might say that they, just as they would ask a living friend to pray for them, they would ask a dead friend to pray for them, and that the saints are friends, and that they're not directly able to answer our prayers, but we ask them to pray for us, and they bring those prayers to God, and there it is. And there's a line in the Bible about the power of the prayer of the faithful. So there's that. Obviously, Mary is the most prominent saint for Catholics and for Orthodox, right? One other thing I will mention here are the church fathers, or sometimes called the church fathers and mothers. The church fathers are a very important group of Christian thinkers. Some of them were bishops, many were not. Many were priests, many were not. Some were monks, some were not, or many were not, right? Many of them did some kind of preaching, often as priests, but not always. A lot of them, maybe in some sense, all of them, or close to all of them, wrote. They could have written whole books. These could take the form of Bible commentaries. It could just be we have letters from them, or sermons from them, or poems from them, whatever it is. But typically they wrote. And they're called the fathers, or fathers and mothers. They're singled out for special attention because their writings are viewed by Catholics and by Orthodox is being especially authoritative. And the way that Catholics and Orthodox view this is, again, you have the bishops that go back to the apostles, and it's like unbroken line of succession. And some of those bishops are among the church fathers, but again, many of the church fathers are not bishops. But the rest are viewed as people who are in line with the broader tradition and who are custodians of the broader tradition. And what you see here is that this idea of tradition matters a lot to Catholics and to Orthodox. And there's some similarities here with Judaism, where again, you can go back to the rabbis in a sense of rabbinic Judaism with the Talmud and other works. And not all Jews accepted the authority of the Talmud and these other pieces of rabbinic literature, but many, many Jews did, and rabbinic Judaism emerged triumphant, and almost all Jews today fall under the umbrella of rabbinic Judaism in some sense or other. And the rabbis of rabbinic Judaism had various ways of defending the authority of the rabbinic text. But one way of doing this was appealing to tradition and arguing that you can't really understand the Jewish scriptures reading them completely on your own. If you just read, this is an argument that the rabbis of rabbinic Judaism would make for rabbinic Judaism, and the Catholics will make for Catholicism, and the Orthodox will make for Orthodoxy, and many Muslims will make for their versions of Islam. It's going to be more complicated with Protestantism, but here goes. What many of these rabbis would say, it's not their only argument, but it's one argument they would give for rabbinic Judaism and the authority of the Talmud and other texts, is they would say, look, if you suppose you don't rely on the Talmud, you don't rely on any of these rabbinic texts, how are you going to interpret the Jewish scriptures? The interpretation's going to be all over the place. You're not going to know how to apply the laws, so forth and so on. You can't read these books in a vacuum. You really need to rely on this tradition. God wants people to understand what the Bible means, what these texts means. He's going to help them to understand what it means. How does he do that? Well, through these, this line of bishops that goes back to the apostles, and through these other figures that are reflecting the teaching of the bishops going back to the apostles, and that are steeped in this tradition that goes back to the beginning of the church, or so it's claimed. Right. And so there it is. And what you have in Catholicism and in Orthodoxy is the Bible's a central text. But the idea, again, is you need guides to read the Bible. And the Bible is read through the lens of the Church Fathers. Are the Church Fathers then regarded as infallible? No, they can't be. They disagree with one another sometimes on stuff. But they do agree with one another a lot on a lot of things. And, you tend to follow them where they agree, and where they don't agree, sometimes it's a bit messy, and you just kind of accept that, it's just kind of how it goes. Right. So, you have these church fathers. They're very, very important for the Catholics and the Orthodox. There are different sets of fathers in different languages. But for the Catholics, the two important sets of fathers are the so-called Latin fathers that wrote in Latin, which are sometimes called the Western Fathers, and the Greek fathers who wrote in Greek, which are sometimes called the Eastern Fathers. But there were important fathers, for the Catholics that wrote in other languages as well, some Middle Eastern languages, and the same is true for the Eastern Orthodox. The Greek fathers are very important for them, but many of the Latin fathers are important for them too, and many of them also revere fathers who were Arabs and who wrote in languages other than Greek, who wrote in various Middle Eastern languages, right? So it's not just the Latin and the Greek traditions. Just to add a little, by the way, if you're interested in the fathers, there's a lot of books you could read. One that I recommend is this one. Beginning to Read the Fathers by Boniface Ramsey, who is a Catholic. This is the revised edition, and it's a nice book to start off with. And one thing that Ramsey, says in that book, and he's absolutely right about this, is the Catholics tend to view the period of the Church Fathers is ending somewhere around the 600s or the 700s, so some stretch it all the way to the 1100s with a figure named Bernard of Clairvaux. For the Eastern Orthodox, it's pretty common to see the period of the Church Fathers extending all the way to the present day, right? Who are some of the and some of these figures? I mean, they've been massively influential people because they really helped, define as much as they ever do get defined, the doctrine of the Trinity and the two natures of Christ, and some of them help, write, the Nicene Creed and things like this. So who are some of the most, who are some of the most well-known church fathers? In the West, if you ask a lot of Catholics who's the greatest Catholic theologian of all time, many would say Thomas Aquinas. He lived from like 1224, 1225 to like, oh my goodness, somewhere in the 1270s. Maybe around like 1225 to 1274 or something like that was Thomas Aquinas. He's often not regarded as a church father. Many Catholics will say he's the greatest Catholic theologian of all time. Other Catholics will say, no, it's St. Augustine. And I have a lot of respect for Thomas Aquinas, but I think Augustine maybe honestly he's got a pretty good claim to the title too, greatest Catholic theologian ever, right? Maybe these debates are kind of silly, but there it goes. St. Augustine, who died, I think, in the year 430, so a long time before Thomas Aquinas. I mean, St. Augustine was a massively important figure in the Catholic Church and really in European civilization. And actually, he was beloved by a lot of Protestants. So a lot of Protestants to this very day love St. Augustine and often view him as really a Protestant in spirit. So obviously many Catholics dispute that, but there it goes. So Augustine, hugely important. What are some other ones? Gregory the Great, very, very important for the Catholics. Who are some Eastern ones that are hugely important for the Eastern Orthodox and for the Catholics? Saint Athanasius, Saint Basil the Great, Saint John Chrysostom, Saint Gregory Nazianzus, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, two Syrians who are, actually was Ephraim? Yeah, two Syrians who were important, really important for Catholics and Orthodox are Isaac of Nineveh, or sometimes called Isaac the Syrian, and Ephraim the Syrian, right? So there it is. There's lots and lots of them. And there it is, right? Some of these Latin fathers, like Augustine and Gregory the Great, have a little bit of a mixed legacy among the Eastern Christians, but they're still regarded as fathers and as saints, right? So those are some of the things that unite the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox. So we've noticed some differences here. What are some things that distinguish the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox? What are some things that distinguish them? There's a number of things. Actually, Catholics and Orthodox tend to have very, very different views of the significance of Jesus's death, his crucifixion, and resurrection. I brought this up in the last video. Christians make this claim that it's through Jesus dying on the cross and rising from the dead that forgiveness is made available to the human race in a special way. How is that supposed to work? Catholics and Orthodox tend to have very, very different views on that, which are really quite interesting. They tend to have very, very different views on the nature of sin. They tend to have very, very different views on the nature of heaven and hell. I'm going to have to put this in a whole separate video, so that'll just have to wait. For now, I mean, here, let me just start a few things quickly. Again, the Catholics have the Pope. The Eastern Orthodox don't. They don't recognize the authority of the Pope like that. Many of you are probably aware that Roman Catholic priests cannot marry. Actually, in early Christianity, the priests were allowed to marry. At some point, the Catholics in the West, who become the Catholics, say, we're not going to let you guys marry anymore. In the East, they never placed that restriction. So most Eastern Orthodox priests are married. Catholic priests, by and large, are not married. There's actually a handful that are married because, like if you're an Orthodox priest and you get married and then you convert to Catholicism, you can become a priest and still have your wife. So there's actually, surprisingly, there's a fairly small number of Catholic priests that are married, but there's a handful. But in general, you're not allowed to get married if you are a Catholic priest. If you've been to a Catholic church, you might know that Catholics often have statues in their churches. Eastern Orthodox really don't use statues. Eastern Orthodox use icons. Some Catholics use icons, but many do not. The idea behind this icon is it's a piece of wood that is painted with the image of, it's often Jesus or one of the saints or an image from the Bible or church history. And the idea is it's kind of like a window into heaven where if you pray in front of this icon, the spiritual reality depicted on the icon is mediated in some mystical way to the believer and is kind of like a vehicle of grace, something maybe like a sacrament, actually, right? Oh my goodness, there's so many things I could say. The Orthodox services tend to be longer than the Catholic services. Orthodox fasting rituals tend to be pretty intense. So, you may be aware that a lot of Catholics will fast during Lent, this period of time, 40 days leading up to Easter, the day on which Christians believe Jesus rose from the dead. So Lent kind of culminates in Good Friday, which commemorates the day that Jesus was crucified, Holy Saturday, this second day in which he's dead, and Easter Sunday when he rises from the dead. And again, the idea here is by Jesus dying on the cross and rising from the dead, this makes forgiveness for sins available to the human race, makes fellowship with God available to the human race in a way that it previously wasn't, in a special way. So many Christians spend their time before these days in this period of Lent reflecting on their sins, going to confession, things like this. During this time, Lent, many Catholics will fast on Fridays. How so? They won't eat meat on Fridays. This is actually why Red Lobster tends to have a lot more cars in the parking lot during Fridays in Lent. This is why if you go to a place like Portillo's, you might see a pepper and egg sandwich on Fridays in Lent, because the Catholics aren't eating meat, but they might still be eating fish, right? And that's how it goes. Oftentimes, too, Catholics will give up something like maybe Facebook or whatever it is for Lent. Some Protestants also do practice these things as well. Usually not so much the fasting from meat on or abstention from meat on Fridays, but maybe some other kind of fasting or taking time off from their cell phones or whatever it is, right? To try to get closer to God, focus on reconciling with God through confession, things like this. The Eastern Orthodox, obviously not everybody does this, but they still follow the older. Many still follow the older fasting practices where you are vegan throughout Lent and at least during the week giving up alcohol. Many Orthodox actually the first few days and last few days of Lent, they don't eat food at all. They'll go a couple of days without really eating. There's actually several different major fasting periods in the Orthodox Church, and they're not all equally strict. But if you are an Orthodox Christian and you follow these fasting practices, you're vegan about half of the year, right? And these are practices too that the Western Christians used to follow, but for the most part, a lot of these things have kind of fallen away in modern Catholicism, but they've been kind of maintained at least to some extent in the Christian East. So these are some of the differences that we can see between the churches. By the way, there's a lot that can be said about fasting right now. Does fasting get you into heaven or brownie points or something like that? I mean, there's different thoughts on this. But and there's fasting in Islam and fasting in Judaism and fasting in many other religious traditions as well. Sometimes there is this idea of a point system, that fasting gets you extra points. Sometimes there's this idea that there is no point system. The way that, for example, the Eastern Orthodox Christians think about it, there is no point system here. That the fasting is a way to get to try to be aware of our consumption habits and avoid addictions, and also a way of saving money to give to the poor and things like this. Anyhow, there's maybe at some point in the future I'll make a video on this and go into it in more detail, but I'm already like an hour and 10 minutes in. I got to wrap this up. So we've talked about similarities between similarities and differences between Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. What about the Protestants? Well, again, I'm not really sure the Protestants, the early Protestants at least, were really even aware of Orthodoxy or thought much about it. They were certainly aware of Catholicism. The early Protestants were all Catholics. They came out of the Catholic Church. The first Protestant is generally regarded to be Martin Luther, who in 1517, according to tradition, I think some historians question this now. I'm not sure where the scholarship is on it right now, but according to tradition, in 1517, he nailed these 95 theses, these like 95 complaints against the Catholic Church, to the cathedral door, the door of the cathedral, which is where the main church of the bishop, in Wittenberg, in the Holy Roman Empire, these German-speaking states, right? And as I mentioned in a previous video, Martin Luther was not trying to destroy the Catholic Church. He wasn't trying to bury the Catholic Church. He wasn't trying to start a new church, a Protestant church. He was trying to reform the Catholic Church, to reform it. And actually, he wasn't the first person who tried to do this. There were people who tried to reform the Catholic Church before Luther, and actually a lot of them got executed by the Catholic Church. One thing that historians have to explain, how did Luther not get himself executed? Well, we can look at that, and then we'll look at the nature of his complaints, right? How did he not get executed? Well, we think it was a couple things that really helped him out. One was he lived in a place called the Holy Roman Empire. What was the Holy Roman Empire? The joke is it wasn't holy or Roman or an empire. It wasn't necessarily all that holy. It wasn't really Roman. These are mostly German-speaking states. And it wasn't really quite an empire. It was headed by a guy called the Emperor, but at various points this guy was elected. And I've sometimes heard the Holy Roman Empire, it's not a perfect analogy, but likened to the United States. We have like 50 states that elect one president. It's not exactly what's going on in the Holy Roman Empire, but it's not maybe completely off exactly either, right? This emperor is sometimes elected, not necessarily democratically by all the people, but by the princes of the various states who would come together. And at least some of them would come together, and the really powerful ones, and kind of decide who the emperor was going to be. At least some of the time, that's how it worked. I think sometimes it passed from father to son. But anyhow, this Holy Roman Empire, which is founded by Charlemagne, I think it's back around the year 800. It continues. A lot of the territories of it are these German states, and the thing to note is this: there's a lot of different states in the Holy Roman Empire, and they're outside of Italy, right? So they have some autonomy from the Pope, and in particular, and sometimes the Emperor, which actually happened in Luther's time, is somebody who's got some connections with the Pope, and it maybe strongly supports the Pope. But the Emperor doesn't have like total control over all the states in his dominion, and he doesn't have total control over the princes who run the states that are within his dominion. So Luther happens to live in a Holy Roman Empire, and happens to live in a state in a Holy Roman Empire where the prince of that state likes Luther and affords him protection. And, the ability of the emperor to just kind of come in there and tell this guy what to do with Martin Luther, is somewhat limited. Some other factors that maybe contribute to Luther being able to survive and not get executed. Again, if he had lived in a place like Spain or, certain parts of Italy, he might have had a very, very different fate. But some other things that are going on is actually the Turks are attacking Western Europe, threatening Western Europe. And so the Holy Roman Emperor is kind of busy dealing with the Turkish threat. Also, we have the printing press in the West that's now underway. with Gutenberg's printing press. And so, Luther kind of is protected by this prince. The emperor's kind of busy worrying about the Turks. And now there's this printing press, and he can publish his complaints against the Catholic Church and distribute them widely. And it's kind of hard to get the toothpaste back into the tube, right? So these are some things that contribute to Luther not getting executed by the church and surviving. I think the Catholic Church did actually try him in absentia and sentence him to death, but he didn't show up. It was an abstention. He didn't show up to the trial. He didn't get executed. So if Luther wasn't trying to destroy the church or start a new church, what was he doing? Again, he was trying to reform the church. He wanted the church to change some things. Well, what did he want him to change? Well, and what about these other reformers? What did they want the church to change? They didn't all agree, but there were some common issues that came up, and I'll focus on some of the ones that were near and dear to Luther. Even though, as I said a bit ago, priests were able to marry in the early church, and they're always been allowed to marry in the Orthodox Church, the Catholics at some point stopped letting their priests marry. But many of these priests were still having sex, and it was actually quite well known. And this actually still happens today, right? And it was quite. It's not something actually today that a lot of Catholics discuss, but it was discussed a lot in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. It was discussed a lot. And we have evidence of lots and lots and lots of Western European Christians getting really angry, that priests were having sex with married women or maybe unmarried women in town and getting them pregnant and things like this. And this is something that a lot of Catholics are really, really angry about, priestly conduct. Luther was upset that a lot of the priests were not very well trained. Luther was upset about the buying and selling of bishoprics. So something that happened in a number of Catholic territories is this position of bishop, which is supposed to be really sacred. You would have bishops selling their position as bishop. Now, why would they do that? It's like selling a business. The bishop could take a lot of money from the collection. And even if you're making a lot of money, people who have successful businesses, they sometimes sell the business. You might retire or something like that, or whatever it is. Or you're making a good amount of money every year, but someone offers you a big lump sum for it. You just sell off the business. You want that big amount of money. You had people who were selling their office of bishop, and to people who might just be buying it just to collect money and not even really show up or teach or do their duties, really. This was a big deal. Some other problems were the selling of indulgences. The Roman Catholic Church basically, told people that there is this thing called purgatory. And purgatory has been conceived in different ways by different Catholics. Some of you may know of Dante and his poem, The Comedy. It was called later the Divine Comedy, which is often how we refer to it, though he just called it the Comedy. In Dante's Comedy or Divine Comedy, it's a story about how he visits hell, Inferno in Italian. That's the first part of the poem. Then he goes to Purgatorio. And then at the end, he goes to heaven, Paradiso, Paris. So there's three parts of his poem: hell, purgatory, and heaven, basically. And it's a really fantastic poem. I teach a whole class on this at COD. I really love it. When you go to purgatory, for Dante, purgatory is like a spiritual gym. It's like a spiritual gym. And the idea that Dante seems to have, which resonates with a lot of Christians, and you can find similar ideas in Buddhism and Hinduism and other traditions, is that if I died right now and went to heaven, I would not enjoy the fullness of God's presence. Why? Because I'm still a broken sinner, right? I'm still inclined to greed and pride and things like this. So even if I went to heaven, it wouldn't really be fully heaven for me. To really be ready for heaven, you have to reform yourself, right? You have to undergo reformation. A spiritual reformation, spiritual healing, spiritual growth. You have to achieve spiritual maturity. And this is largely what purgatory is for Dante. It's growing up, right? It's growing up. There is maybe also a sense in Dante that you are like paying the debt you owe for your sin, but a lot of the emphasis is on healing and growth, right? For a lot of Catholics, though, the focus has been more just on the paying the debt, not necessarily on the growth. And, you have ideas here, like, for example, if you've committed some serious sins and you haven't fully repented for them before you die, you might have to spend some time undergoing some kind of like um, torture, or maybe not quite torture, but some serious hardship in order to like pay off your debt so that you can be permitted to go to heaven. And even on the harsher views of purgatory, it's still a very good thing to go to purgatory, because if you die and wake up in purgatory, no matter how hard it is, you are guaranteed to eventually be admitted to heaven. You don't go from purgatory to hell ever. You only go from purgatory to heaven. But the idea here is it could be pretty harsh, it can be pretty painful. And even in Dante, it can be pretty painful in various ways, because growth is painful, right? Growing up is painful. And even in Dante, the idea here is that you could be sped through purgatory more quickly through prayer, especially the prayer of the faithful. And what the Catholic Church teaches in the Middle Ages, and technically, I believe this is still part of official Catholic doctrine, though I don't think the Catholic Church has sold indulgences for a long time. But the root idea behind indulgences is that the saints can build up what is called a treasury of merit, It's kind of like the saints, by being really good, generate these points that the Pope can use to like counterbalance negative points of people in purgatory and get them through purgatory more quickly to go to heaven. You do not have these kind of teachings at all in the Eastern Orthodox Church. They're not there at all. There is really no point system at all in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And Protestants, who often have a type of point system, they don't have purgatory, they don't have this type of thing. But the Catholics have this idea of the treasury of merits of the saints. And they haven't done this for a long time, but they used to. The popes used to actually, they would tell people that if you paid them money, they would get you out of purgatory more quickly. And actually, what you're doing here is you're doing it for your deceased relatives. So if somebody, for example, they had a father or a grandfather or a mother or a grandmother that died as a Catholic, but the worry was they might be in purgatory for a long time, you would give money to the Pope, and the Pope would like promise that your loved one would get to heaven more quickly. And actually, the church got quite rich off of this and funded construction projects like, I think actually some of this went to funding St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which is, again, is a really, really beautiful church. And a lot of Catholics actually started getting really angry about this. And Martin Luther was very angry about it. He's living in these German-speaking states, the Holy Roman Empire, kind of far from Italy. And he's saying, look, we have all these like Germans who are, sending all their money over to Rome, and the Pope's getting rich and all this stuff. And a lot of the popes are very, very rich. And, it's really upset about it. Another thing he says is, he's like, I don't see this anywhere in the Bible. He says, I don't see it anywhere in the Bible. Where is this written in the Bible? He says, it's not written in the Bible. And another thing is, he starts looking around the Catholic practices, and I'm sure he would have said the same thing about some of the Orthodox practices. I just don't know if that was on his radar. And he starts saying, I don't see this stuff in the Bible. So he starts raising concerns about praying to saints. He starts raising concerns about a lot of the Catholic sacraments. Luther does not throw out all the sacraments, but he restricts them to two. I think at a certain point he might have envisioned three sacraments, but he focuses on baptism and the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist. And I think at one point he might have regarded confession, reconciliation as a third sacrament, but Maybe I'm wrong about that, but at any rate, he certainly recognizes baptism and the Lord's Supper, right? But he doesn't recognize marriage as a sacrament. He recognizes marriage as an institution, right? But he doesn't recognize it as a sacrament. The whole idea of having priests, he has a problem with. He says it's not really a biblical idea. Having monks, these people nuns, these men and women who stay in monasteries all day and pray all day and read the Bible all day, he says this is not in the Bible. And there's a lot of other things he thinks are not in the Bible. He ends up, arguing that the Catholics have, misunderstood the nature of salvation and getting to heaven. This is a huge, huge debate, which, oh my goodness, it could easily, I usually spend at least a whole class period in the face-to-face class talking about this. And this video is almost already an hour and a half long. I can't go into it, even though it's such an important idea. But I'll be very brief about this. Luther accuses the Catholics of joining works to faith. Now, what does that mean? If faith here is like what you believe and works is what you do, right? Luther says that the way you get to heaven is only through what you believe. It's only through faith. Technically, you don't have to do anything to get to heaven. You just have to believe. That's it. And he accuses the Catholics of saying that that's wrong. And he accuses the Catholics of saying you have to believe and do good deeds. And Luther says you do not have to do good deeds. You just have to believe. Now, actually, Luther's position is a bit more complicated than that. And the Catholic position actually is definitely more complicated than that. But that's the way that Luther reads it, just in a nutshell, very quickly. And Luther insists on being saved by faith alone, through grace alone, through the merits of Christ alone, which basically means faith. We can do contrasts here. Saved by faith, not works. Saved by the work of Christ, not our work, and not the saints' work. It's like Christ and Christ alone. It's like what Christ did on the cross. That's it. You believe in that, that's it. You're saved. Again, there's a lot more about this that could be said. A lot of Catholics, by the way, would say that they actually do teach a type of version of faith alone. Also, this whole idea of what faith is gets really complicated. Is it just belief, or is it some kind of trust? Like there's a letter in the New Testament, the letter to James, that says, well, even the demons believe that Christ is risen, but that doesn't mean that they're saved, and this gets into a lot of complicated issues. But anyhow, you get some sense then of Luther's complaints, right? Like Luther is saying that there's just a lot of moral corruption in the church, and there's theological corruption. That there's a lot of like priests and bishops doing things that are just immoral, he says. And there are teachings of the church that are wrong. And he thinks that's because the church has relied too much on traditions that are not in the Bible, and that we need to turn to just the Bible. And just to carry this out a little bit, it is a little more complicated than that, because you might say, well, and this is another claim of Luther's, sola scriptura, Bible alone, faith alone, grace alone, merits of Christ alone. Okay. Does this mean that Luther doesn't like the church fathers? Actually, a lot of the Protestants love the church fathers, or at least they love some of them. They don't regard them as infallible, but then neither do the Catholics, right? Actually, a lot of the Protestants end up saying that the church fathers got it right, but that the Catholics misinterpreted the church fathers. And a lot of the Protestants, they look to Augustine, and they see Augustine is anticipating a lot of their readings of Scripture. But there's also some open critique of some of the church fathers by some of the Protestants. Anyhow, here's how it goes. So, Luther, again, he doesn't want to destroy the Catholic Church. He doesn't want to start a new church. He wants the Catholics to agree with him. And they basically say, no, we're going to kill you. And so there it goes. And pretty soon, a lot of people start listening to Luther, and they like Luther's ideas. A lot of them, they're upset with, these moral problems in the church, and they're sympathetic to his critique of Catholic theology. and especially this idea of Bible alone, not traditions, and salvation by faith alone, through grace alone, by the merits of Christ alone. It becomes a very, very powerful message. The Protestant Reformation actually is one of the most influential intellectual movements in the whole modern world, really, in human history. It becomes very, 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 very powerful, and spreads to a lot of regions in Europe, and then eventually throughout the world. Though if you go to places like Italy today, you don't have a lot of Protestants, but there's some traditions, and actually there were some important Protestant leaders in the early Reformation that were Italians, right? So here's the thing that happens, though. Luther says we gotta go back to the Bible and read it for ourselves without the context of this tradition and figure out what it means for ourselves. And when they do that, there's lots of disagreements about it. And Luther's right-hand man, this guy named Philip Melanchthon, ends up disagreeing with Luther on some of his fundamental ideas. And other Lutherans disagree with Luther and amongst themselves on his fundamental ideas. And then you get other groups of Protestant who just think the Lutherans are really off base. So you start getting the Reformed tradition and other traditions, like the various Anabaptist traditions. And you start getting splits and splits and splits and splits and splits. Now, these Protestants, let's try and wrap up here. These Protestants, do they disagree with everything that the Catholic Church teaches? No. Luther actually, he likes a good, rich liturgy, kind of like a Catholic liturgy. Luther, he keeps two of the sacraments at least, baptism and Eucharist. Luther also baptizes babies like the Catholics do. Luther also believes in the real presence. He doesn't accept all of the Catholic teachings around it, but Luther agrees that when you take the bread and the wine, you are consuming the real body and blood of Jesus, right? Luther agrees with that. He's pretty close to the Catholics on some of these fundamental issues, right? But he doesn't pray to Mary. He doesn't pray to the saints. He doesn't regard marriage as a sacrament. And again, he insists on faith alone, grace alone, through the merits of Christ alone. There's a lot more that can be said about that. But then other Protestants, they're gonna think that Luther has failed to break away enough from the Catholics, and they're gonna accuse Luther of being too Catholic. They're gonna say to Luther, no, when you take the bread and the wine, you're not consuming the actual body and blood of Jesus. So actually, some non-Lutherans do agree with them on that in different ways, but a lot of them don't. You start to get Protestants saying this is just a symbol. The bread and wine's just a symbol. In no way are you, really spirit, whatever it is. You are not consuming the body and blood of Jesus at all in taking the bread and the wine. Pretty much all the Protestants agree, at least initially, we're not going to pray to Mary, we're not going to pray to saints. Some of them start creating completely new liturgies, forms of worship that have a lot less structure than the Catholic liturgy. A lot of them agree with Luther on faith alone, grace alone, merits of Christ alone. Some of you may be aware that some of the Protestants start saying, we're not going to baptize babies, right? We're only going to baptize adults. Church structure becomes really debated. What are the authority structures in the church? That becomes a huge issue. And so you get splits and splits and splits within Protestantism. The Catholic Church never really reforms any of its doctrines in the light of Protestant protest. The Catholic Church does, though, end up agreeing that there's a lot of moral problems in the church, and it does initiate something called the Counter-Reformation, which is supposed to be a response to Protestantism, but also a way of reforming moral problems in the church, right? So that does that, and it's connected with various artistic and intellectual movements. I'm trying to see, did I cover basically everything that I want? I'm sure I'm forgetting something, but yeah, we're like an hour and a half in, and boy, 3 long videos. Anyhow, I'm gonna end it here. I will just say this: I've condensed a very long, complicated story into, into a couple hours. If you are interested in this, there are lots and lots of articles and books that you can turn to, good sources I can recommend to you. And really, history is pretty complicated in all of these religions. But some things I just want us to keep in mind, that while there's often disagreements, there's often also a lot of agreement. And it can seem in these debates that a lot of, especially if we don't belong to the religion, but sometimes even if we do, a lot of these debates can seem really, really small. Sometimes they can even seem pretty petty. But a lot of times they're really connected with really deep and interesting issues. And what it often comes down to a lot, I think ultimately all of these debates, all the major debates, at least, they come down to authority. And a lot of it is about texts and traditions. What texts do we recognize as authoritative, and how do we interpret them? And that was a major issue, for the Protestant Reformation. Again, a lot of the Protestants actually really liked at least many of these church fathers, though eventually some just start saying, forget the church fathers, forget about all that stuff. It's just Catholic stuff. But even still, the Protestants would have said, look, even though we like some of these fathers like Augustine, they have no authority independent of the Bible. We just think some of them have actually read the Bible pretty well. Really, it's just the Bible. Right? Now, again, the Catholics did not, regard these fathers. It's actually really complicated because the Catholics do not regard these fathers as infallible, but they often did view God as guiding that tradition in a special way. Honestly, there are Protestants who would agree with that in some respects, because they would say, look, these fathers helped articulate the doctrine of the Trinity and the two natures of Christ, which many Protestants would say are absolutely fundamental. So actually, this is it's actually really kind of complicated to speak of this. Luther does say sola scriptura, Bible alone, but that is kind of complicated. But one thing I think we could say is absolutely the case, that Luther thought that the Catholics had relied way too heavily on mere human tradition, whereas many Catholics thought that just because these traditions were really old, they carried some innate authority. And Luther said everything always has to be checked against the Bible. Again, this is also kind of complicated because Christmas and Easter aren't in the Bible, but pretty much every Christian follows them. You might say, what do you mean Christmas and Easter aren't in the Bible? Well, the birth of Jesus is in the Bible, and Christmas celebrates that. And the resurrection of Jesus is in the Bible, the New Testament, and Christians celebrate that. But the New Testament never talks about celebrating Christmas as a holiday or Easter as a holiday. And so, sometimes Catholics will come back and say, well, look, you're celebrating Christmas, you're celebrating Easter. That's not in the New Testament either. But Protestants have responses to that, and Catholics might have responses to that. Look, it starts to get complicated, pretty complicated. But what you're going to see happen here, the debates are really ultimately coming down to how we're reading the Bible. And we get similar debates, in Judaism over the authority of these rabbinic texts, or even in Judaism today over how those texts are to be interpreted and applied. In Islam, we're going to get debates over how to interpret the Quran, and we're going to get debates about the authority of texts outside the Quran. And so it goes for other traditions. In Buddhism, there's massive debates about what scriptures are authoritative, and sometimes different Buddhists agree that a certain text is authoritative, but they interpret those texts in very, very different ways. I think as Americans, we often think, well, I learned how to read in second grade, I know how to read. But you look at these religions and what you see is massively educated people with one, maybe two PhDs who've been studying these things for 40 years. They often read the text in very, very different ways. I don't want to make it sound like it's complete chaos and there's no way to make any heads or tails of this in any of the religions. I don't think that's true. But it's complicated. And I think a really good question to keep in mind whenever you're studying religion is try and pay as much attention as you can to how people are interpreting their texts. And often you could like any of these religions, you could study the whole religion just through the lens of history of interpretation of texts. You could really do it that way, most of it at least. All right, good night.